Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, entrepreneur and soprano Tania Jong, nation's first Indigenous frontbencher, Assistant Health Minister Ken Wyatt, high school chaplain and Muslim community leader Sheikh Wesam Charkawi, Greens MP for Melbourne Adam Bandt, and Tasmanian Senator Lisa Singh, a once rising Labor star who's fallen victim to her own party's factions. Please welcome our panel. We've got a lot of great questions tonight. Let's go to our first one. It's from Alice Dung.
So my question is, what is it about the Islamic religion or people that makes them susceptible to radicalisation, and what can be done to mitigate this?
Wesam Charkawi.
Thank you, Tony, and I thank the questioner. Can I first start by saying that this tragic event has touched the whole community. We too are grieving with the victim of this awful crime. Our faith teaches to withhold our hands from breaking the branch of a tree, let alone taking the life of a human being, which equates to taking the life of humanity. And saving the life of one amounts to saving the life of all. These are bedrock principles. This is a complex issue. And in reality, it's a human problem, and it requires a whole community effort. It requires a holistic effort. I'm on the ground and I speak to a lot of these youth, and I can tell you that the reason why it requires a different way of doing things as to what we've previously done is because I'm seeing a lot of identity issues with the young men and women, and I keep hearing from many on the streets and in the schools that I visit that they tell us that we don't belong. They say that we're not part of the Australian society, we're not part of the Australian community, that we're terrorists, that we're extremists, that our religion is one that is of destruction and loss of life and so on and so forth. Now, you've got to remember that these people were born into the age of terror and they're being told that they don't belong. What that leads to is to marginalisation and isolation. And if you add that to the mix of the propaganda that is being put forward by the groups like ISIS, it's a very dangerous mix. And so you see that it requires a whole of society effort, and that's the reality of it. We can't just do what we've done in the past. It really requires everybody to get on board.
Wesam, do you have a clear idea how a 15-year-old boy like Fahad Jabbar can end up so full of hatred and in a very quick space of time be radicalised to the point where he is ready to kill someone?
Look, we don't have all the answers. I mean, we too are grappling for answers as to how this young man got his hands on a gun and who was involved in this person going down that track. But what I can definitely tell you is that, yes, we are seeking the answers, and the community isn't stuck in the mud. They are really addressing this issue, and they're on the front lines in addressing this issue. As to how that happened, we don't know. But what we do know is that there is a definite problem of isolation, marginalisation. We are talking about propaganda online, where one investigation that was done by the government came up with the findings that some of these kids could not tell the difference between what was truth and what was propaganda. And governments themselves around the world, Australia and abroad, are grappling to counter the narrative online. So it's a problem that not only governments are grappling with, but also communities. And so that's why it needs a holistic effort. As to how this whole event unfolded, we don't have all the answers, but we'd like to know. So we could remedy these issues, because this is an issue that needs to be remedied, and it needs to be remedied because if we don't, then we can't break that cycle that we've been seeing over and over.
Let me go to Ken Wyatt. The question implied, I suppose, that the problem is in the religion. It asks why, what it is about this religion that makes it easy to radicalise people, and it says what can be done to mitigate it. First of all, do you agree with the premise of the question?
No, I don't. I think that what we've got to seriously consider is that disaffected individuals or young individuals who are isolated turn to somebody for companionship and for somebody who will reach out and take them into their realm of being. And I think one of the problems we have is that a community must be involved. It's not only just the remit of government, and I know that Malcolm Turnbull has met with you and the Muslim community, because it is about the tiers of government working with the community, and that means not only the Muslim community, it means Australian community as well, because this becomes a community issue that we all have to become involved in. And the challenge that I sometimes grapple with is that we have individuals who do the wrong thing, but we never take the vilification of a race of people on those matters. But on this one in particular, we turn to the Muslim issue. I think it's more of an individual issue and the types of supports that we've got to offer. And that's why government is committed, and I know that both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition will be meeting with Muslim leaders to talk through what it is that we do collectively.
That's actually happening tomorrow, that initial meeting, and then of course there's a big summit on Thursday, which is meant to really start coming up with some solutions. Do you have any idea, Ken, what's going to be proposed at that summit?
No, but I think there's got to be open dialogue, there's got to be open minds, and there's got to be a commitment that we want to collectively do something together. But also it means that the debate that we have within the community shouldn't be just focused on a religion.
Can I just add to that? This is a very complex issue. This is a human problem. If we take this issue and we restrict it to the Muslim narrative and we say that this is a Muslim problem, what happens is you can't then step back and look for other empirical evidences as to any underpinning or driving forces that may be at hand here. This is a universal phenomenon. You know, terrorism did not begin with September 11, and neither did it begin after the Cold War or Munich or Oklahoma. This has been a universal problem. It's a cyclical problem that has touched every age and every religion. And we have to look at it in terms of what are the other driving factors that are influencing this very issue. And I think if we just simply restrict it, we're never going to end up breaking that cycle.
Let me just ask you a quick question as a follow-up to what we were talking about before. Are you aware of this phenomenon of ISIS or Islamic State sweet talkers, people who are getting somehow to young Muslim kids and managing very quickly, according to the experts, to radicalise them, to turn them to violence?
Well, I mean, this group, they glorify what they do. And you have 100,000 tweets per day. For me, in what I do, in my experience, I have to provide a safe space for young people and a safe space where they can air their grievances without fear that they're going to be put in handcuffs. I mean, you can literally be a young Muslim boy and say the word ISIS and end up in the principal's office and possibly be led away in handcuffs. We are talking about a society that at the moment is very, very paranoid. I come across families all the time, mothers, fathers, where they tell me that, you know, please make sure my son doesn't say the word ISIS. Please make sure my son doesn't say the word terrorism or extremism. They have so much fear. And mind you, that this child doesn't have any inclination whatsoever, but there's such a fear at the moment. And then when they go to school, they're under such scrutiny. I mean, we all saw the example of the boy and the clock in the United States. He was arrested because he brought a clock to school, and there was so much scrutiny there. We need to have those safe spaces where they can talk and feel safe and yes, ask a question. What is, because they're not blind to what's happening around the world. They see what's happening. They want to ask about something that they feel concerning to them. So.
OK, I'm going to bring in another questioner and then bring in the rest of the panel. Next questioner is Hilal Tawakal.
Yeah, good evening. My question is, there are black sheep in every community. I feel it's unfair to target one religion. So as far as the Muslim religion is concerned, it does not teach terrorism. It teaches only peace. So what will the government do about this situation?
OK, I'll start with Adam Bandt here and we'll hear from our other panellists.
Yeah, look, when you come into Melbourne down the Tullamarine Freeway and you get to those yellow and red sort of cheese sticks over it, if you look to your right, you see a big tower block, and it's a public housing block that's in my electorate in Melbourne, and 50% of the people in that public housing tower block identify as Muslim. Now, I've never felt more welcome there than I have anywhere else. But one of the sets of stories that I hear time and time again from people is around this issue of engagement and employment in particular. We've got people there who've got master's degrees who are driving taxis, and what's becoming even worse is we're finding it now happening to the second generation. So picking up on the point before, there are children who are born here who've gone to Melbourne Uni or RMIT or Sydney Uni, get a degree, they send off applications for job interviews, they don't get a call, and as soon as you change your name from Mohammed to David, the phone starts ringing. And then when people are feeling that, and when they're looking at their parents going, well, you've worked really hard and you don't seem to find meaningful work, then we, I think, ourselves as a society are helping create some of the conditions that make it easier for others to then come along and say, see, this society doesn't have a place for you.
Lisa Singh?
Look, I mean, my understanding of the Muslim religion is it's a religion of peace. And I think it's a shocking thing what has happened, you know, halfway around the world where a group of terrorists have basically hijacked this religion for their own aims to commit heinous crimes. And now, of course, to have that, infiltrating its way through sweet talkers or the like into our own Muslim community here is just horrific. And I could imagine it would be very concerning and worrying for the Muslim community here. But we are a proud multicultural country. And as a proud multicultural country, we need to embrace the diversity amongst us, respect the diversity amongst us, and come together in a spirit of inclusiveness as a way to tackle some of these problems. Now, I think over the last couple of years, that spirit perhaps has been challenged. And it has been challenged, I think, at the leadership level. I don't think that the language that has been used over the last couple of years has been very inclusive. I think it's been quite divisive and destructive. And it is my hope that now, under obviously a new Prime Minister, joining with our leader, Bill Shorten, that dialogue, that language, that rhetoric changes. And it comes back to the proud multicultural country that we know, of inclusiveness, of respect for diversity, of ensuring that each and every one of us, no matter what your religion, what your background, you can make it in this country.
I want to hear from Tania de Jong before we move on to our other questions, and I'll get everyone to keep their answers a bit shorter so we can get through more questions.
Sure, yeah. So if we want to create a healthy, happy, inclusive and innovative Australia, then we need to empower every voice, as Lisa's just stated. And that means that we need to remove the labels, the us and them. We need to remove the boxes and the walls between us, and we need to start building bridges of understanding. Everyone longs for this place to be their home, to feel a sense of self, a sense of belonging, to find their true voice here and to feel respect. And we can create this, but at the moment, your question was about the government. And at the moment, we have a fairly top-down, siloed social welfare system. And what we need to do is create a system where our social problems come back into the communities, because we as citizens can solve these problems together. And the top-down, siloed approach hasn't been working.
OK, we're going to move on to some other questions on the same topic. The first one's from Jack Deegan.
How do we expect Muslims to immigrate to Australia as refugees and assimilate properly when a Muslim leader in Parramatta has been here for 18 years and does not speak English? Surely he must be interested in assimilating, and it just carries on from there that the people that come into this country would be influenced by him. It just seems wrong.
Wesam.
Look, I think at the end of the day, what's important to remember here, and I thank you for your question, is that we want the right messages being put out to the community. Can you imagine that somebody spoke the language of English very well and put out a dangerous message? I mean, that would be far worse. So I think the objective here is to look for a positive message that has great impact on the community. And I have heard that being articulated before, and I have read some articles about leaders or not leaders having to speak the English.
Well, it was articulated today by the chairman of the Parramatta Mosque, Neil El Kadomi, who's come out and said we need a mufti who can speak English, frankly.
Yes.
I mean, is he right? I mean, is it really difficult to communicate with the broader public about what your message is if you have a Grand Mufti who doesn't speak English?
Well, again, you have to look at the Mufti's messages that he's putting out, which are very, very positive. And the Mufti guides and he basically instructs all of the imams and scholars. And that has a cascading effect. And I'm an example of that. I mean, he's had a positive effect on me, and I speak English. And, you know, how long we may one day have a Mufti that speaks English. He is a great man. How long did Australia wait to get a female Prime Minister? We could also ask. We waited a long time for that.
Yep. And look what happened to her. Anyway, actually, the other part of that question was about assimilation. Adam Bandt, I'm going to bring you in on that. The suggestion was that the Mufti not speaking English prevents assimilation. It's not a word we hear often these days. What do you think about the idea?
I'd say I've met a lot of older Greeks and Italians and Vietnamese people who, when you've got people in their 60s, 70s and 80s, a lot of them don't speak great English either. But the thing about coming to Australia is that the values in Australia rub off. And I think they're increasingly rubbing off on younger generations. And never have I met, from my experience in Melbourne, dealing with members of the Muslim community on quite a regular basis, never have I met a group of people, to make a generalisation, who are so keen to find good jobs and to put their kids through schools and get education here. And the biggest thing that we find is having to deal with the barriers to getting that happening, the barriers to employment that I've spoken to before, or the barriers about feeling included. I think before we go and point the fingers at others, I think we have to have a little bit of a look at our own backyard and make sure we're doing everything we possibly can to make people feel included.
Tania.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's imperative that people do make an effort to speak English. I understand that older generations will find that more difficult. But I think that with new refugees coming into Australia, it probably should be a condition of coming in that people actually do make a commitment to learn English, because if you don't speak English, you're going to lead to ostracisation, isolation, you're going to be discriminated against, and you're not going to find your true voice in your new homeland. So
what do you think about the general idea of assimilation? As I said earlier, it's an old-fashioned idea in some respects in a multicultural society.
Yeah, well, look, I come from a Jewish background and I guess I've assimilated quite a lot into the community, and I think that we need to make people feel as comfortable here as possible. And it's important to celebrate the things that make our cultures and religions unique, but also we can share some of that but still be part of this wonderful country that is Australia.
OK, we'll just go to another question on the same topic, and it does indicate a certain amount of misunderstanding, I think. Let's hear from Don Collins.
Sheikh Charkawi, it seems to me that on a daily basis, over a long period of time, Muslims are in the news, and it's not really very joyous news, really. So do you think that Christians and Muslims can live together? And on an assimilation and a religious point of view, do you think that you would allow your child to marry a Christian in a dual denomination wedding? And if not, why not?
Wesam.
Thank you for your question. It's a multifaceted question, dual-faceted question. Let me just start by saying that, first and foremost, historically, in terms of can Muslims and Christians live together, absolutely yes. And, you know, back in the days of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, when the Muslims were being persecuted, the Prophet Muhammad sent many of the companions to an Abyssinian king who was Christian. And he sent them there because there was one point about that particular king which was a very positive, very good thing and a needed thing in society, and that was justice. And when the Muslims went there, they lived under his rule for a very, very long time until safety could be guaranteed. Even we have further examples where even Christians, they came into the Prophet's mosque and they were allowed to stay there and pray there. There is absolutely no obstacle to Muslims and Christians living together. And this has happened historically, and I can cite you many, many examples. I mean, that's really an underpinning and bedrock principle that we have, that we can live together. And if somebody needs my help, I certainly don't ask them, what faith do you belong to? If somebody, is a poor man, I don't ask them. It's not about faith, but rather it's about humanity. And that's what it's about. And that's what we've been instructed to do. And we can live side by side. I know Christianity also has very, very moral principles, just like ours. They're universals that we all accept. As for in terms of a marriage between having a Christian and a Muslim marry, then if you look at the jurisprudence and you're going down the jurisprudence of it now, well, there is a point where it is valid. I mean, it is a valid marriage. It can be a valid marriage, to answer your question. But ultimately, what they decide upon, I mean, that's up to them. I can't go beyond that.
I have to say, we've had a couple of rabbis on this program at different times, and to be fair, we've never asked them that question. I'm just wondering, do you think there is a sort of general level of misunderstanding between Christians and Muslims outside of the higher levels of each faith? Do you think there's a sort of fear in the community?
I do. There is a fear and there is a misunderstanding. And a lot of the people that I come across when I visit and I go to the outback is they tell me, you know, does your religion say to do this and does your religion say to do that? I honestly find that sometimes there is a misunderstanding. And I think the only way that we're going to remove this misunderstanding is engagement. So we need to engage one another. We need to put a face to the person that the people fear. And I think Islam is feared because it is misunderstood. Not many people know what it stands for. But I tell you that, you know, I would help any person, regardless of their faith, regardless of their background, even if they're atheist. These are our core principles. And so this cannot be disputed. But yes, to go to your question, there is a misunderstanding by many because of the information that they
okay, let's just very briefly, on the other side of that equation, these young kids who are being radicalised, possibly by ISIS sweet talkers here in Australia, possibly online, maybe both. And I'm just wondering what you say to them about their level of misunderstanding, because you have met kids like this on the verge of serious radicalisation.
Look, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a complex issue, and I can't pinpoint any one thing, but regardless of how we look at it at the end of the day, the one message that I advocate to these children is that violence is never the answer. I mean, they see injustice in the world and they see inequality in the world, and we all see it. But violence is never the way. And that's what we have to teach, you know, these young men. And it's never the way. And so once we sit down and we have that conversation and we talk about, you know, the things that are happening in their life, you have to give them airtime. You have to be able to listen to them and see what their grievances are. Just the other day, somebody sent me a message about something that happened in the world, and it involved their own family. They say, look, this is how I feel about this issue. And they need somebody to be there for them, and it has to be about care. But ultimately, violence is never the way. And the point is this, that when I'm saying that violence is never the way, that's not my message. Islam preserves the sanctity of life, and that's the message that I give to them. I give to them the message of Islam, which is it preserves the sanctity of life and not the opposite. And this is very, very important in any conversation that we have.
All right, we're going to move on to another question. We will have a slightly different angle on this discussion. They'll bring in the rest of the panel again. It's from James Fry.
Young, confused and alienated from the mainstream society, I was looking to make sense of what I found to be an incredibly confusing world. I thought I found the answers I was looking for. As a young teen, I joined a violent neo-Nazi group. Had it been today, I'm sure I could have just as easily been persuaded by Islamic fundamentalists. History shows us that though extremist ideologies may come and go, those who carry out terror in their name tend to be always the same, young, marginalised men. So why does our government's so-called counter-terrorism strategy continue to focus on the failed approach of sending troops in to fight counterproductive wars, when that money could be reinvested back here in our education and mental health services so that we could reduce the available pool of young men and women who are susceptible to radicalisation?
Now, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, James. I'll start with Adam Bandt.
James, that's a great question, and thank you for your honesty. Of the money that the government announced for its so-called counter-terrorism activities, only 2% of it went towards employment and engagement strategies, and the rest went towards policing. Now, there are people who are doing the kind of work that Sheikh was talking about being on the ground and being able to say, look, that person, I'm a bit worried about them. They're potentially going to fall into the hands of exactly the kind of person that you're talking about. But at the moment, most of them are doing it on a volunteer basis. And the resources that they did have before have been stripped from them. So, A, we need to support the people on the ground who are doing the right thing and put resources. On the question of foreign policy, I think it cannot be denied that one of the recruiting tools of some of these kind of groups is to point to the way that countries like Australia act overseas. We're talking about, look at Syria at the moment. We've got millions of people fleeing a brutal dictator in Assad, and front page of the newspapers were talking about potentially cozying up to him and saying, look, let's just do a deal with him. And that kind of stuff, or you look at what happened last year in the conflict in Palestine, where the conflict involving the Gaza Strip, and you had a couple of thousand Palestinians killed and about 70 on the Israeli side. Now, both actions have been condemned, but our government stood silent. When that happens, when we don't stand up to our allies as well as to the others, that provides fodder for exactly the kind of groups to recruit that you're talking about.
But can I come in there, Tony?
Yes,
Because
Ken.
often we look at those issues that Adam has raised, and they're much more complex than the simplistic view of the way in which those, our involvement becomes. But I want to go back to, there's 5.1 million that the Australian gives to organisations, community organisations, to engage with young people, so that work is done on the ground by community groups. And when I look through the list of all those community organisations, they are groups that are embedded within the communities from which young people come from. And I think they're important ones. But I want to go back to another step, and that is, we've also got to identify in the schooling process those young people, particularly males, who become isolated in the course of their early years of primary schooling through to their later high school years. Because by not intervening and preventing some of the bullying they experience, some of the tensions that are created because of ethnicity, or because they are ignored, then we fester at that level. So there is a need to go right back to the ground roots level of educational
Ken,
pathways.
you're really talking here about racism, I imagine, or,
Look, racism
or
is an
cultural
element.
antagonism at the very least.
Well, cultural antagonism is a problematic issue, and I'm sure the Sheikh would see that in the work that he does, but it's something that we've got to come back to and grapple with that. Conflicts around the world will always occur because nations, for various reasons, intrude in each other's areas, and governments align with allies in order to make decisions that would try and reduce or prevent, and things do go wrong at times. But we've also got to come back within our own community and focus on.
I just want to
what needs be
briefly
done.
hear from Wesam on that particular issue, because the latter part of that question basically pointed at Australian foreign policy and military strategy.
Look, it's very, that's an important question, and I suppose if we can take a model, I mean, in Australia, domestic violence is tackled through, they tackle mental health issues. They provide awareness campaigns. They counter the narrative, and they have support services. So they do that in a way that doesn't demonise all men. And I think that's how we have to start looking at this issue. We can't just really, narrow down the scope of things to one side. In terms of the funding, sometimes some things can be fixed for free. If you change the language, I mean, this can have a profound effect.
Do you sense, by the way, that what the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, is doing?
Absolutely.
Do you sense the change of language will mean a change
I do feel
in the way people feel about it?
Yes, I feel the language is far more inclusive rather than exclusive. And I think that's very important because it has a big effect. When somebody like the Prime Minister comes out and says, we shouldn't discriminate and so on and so forth, and speaks about respect, that makes my job far more easy and effective. But when you look at the opposite of that, when you have somebody who says, we want Muslims to say it, talk about peace and mean it, it's very, very hurtful, and it makes my job far more difficult. And I mean, these are the differences. In terms of funding, we can't just look at this whole issue through the prism of counter-terrorism legislation. It's not going to work just like that. We've spent so much money on it, and mind you, less than 1% of all of that funding went into communities, less than 1%. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we need a new strategy. I'm
going to just go back to questioner James Fry. Now, just from what you said in your question, it seems to me that you feel like you kind of understand, to some degree, the motivation behind these young kids getting radicalised by Islamic State. Can you give us a sense of what you went through and if there's a sort of comparison there?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened to me was I had significant behavioural problems, drug and alcohol problems. I was on the periphery of society. So achieving any kind of success in terms of mainstream goals, in terms of, doing well at sport or at school, all the stuff that young blokes tend to mark themselves by was no longer available to me. So I was looking to achieve in some other way. How could I feel like I belonged? How could I feel like I was part of something, doing something good, instead of constantly getting in trouble?
So, but how could a neo-Nazi organisation give you the sense of doing something good?
Well, all of a sudden the world's no longer complex. It's literally black and white. It's if you follow what we say, you're going to go on a noble path. If you do this, you're going to do good for your community. And the problem's out there. You don't have to work on yourself. You don't have to put in any effort of yourself. They're the problem. The solution is joining us.
And do you see a kind of similar kind of delusion in the minds of the kids who are influenced by Islamic State, which actually, in many respects, does operate like a fascist organisation? There's complete intolerance of other ways of thinking.
Well, absolutely. And these young people, you know, they often join up for what they think is very noble ideas. They're wanting to give back to their community. They're wanting to do the right thing. And these Islamic State recruiters prey on that. And they prey on young men who aren't capable of rational thought because they're marginalised, because they're so desperate to belong to something. So we need to counter that narrative, and great work with you know, people like the Sheikh who can do that.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that, but I want to hear from the other panellists. Lisa Singh.
Thank you, James, for sharing your story. I think what we have learnt so far is that whilst we can have programs which do aim to provide that, you know, inclusion and cohesion that we need, I think we need to be very careful with the language that we use around that. And I think at the moment, you know, calling a program you know, counter-terrorism program or de-radicalisation program is probably not the best use of language to actually, you know, bring the people that we need into that program and into that environment.
What would you call it when obviously
well,
I mean, everyone's talking about de-radicalisation when faced with the problem of radicalisation?
I think it's very negative language, Tony, and I think if we used language like, you know, social cohesion, you know, reintegration. I mean, in Denmark, they went through a similar experience. They had, you know, a rising number of radicalisation going on with their young men, and they went from a complete change from this kind of condemnation to integration, and it was all an integration approach. And I think we can learn from that. I think that is the kind of language that we do need to focus on. But also, you know, quite rightly so, we have had a lot of a focus on national security, and now we do need to back that up more with social cohesion programs. So, you know, Nelson Mandela once said, you know, people aren't born to hate, they learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, then they can learn to love. But we need to value our young people, make them feel included in the community and the society that they live in Australia, so that they know that they are loved. And that starts not just with a program, but with obviously their parents, teachers, police, community leaders, politicians. All of us have a role to play here. It's not an easy solution, I know, and the Sheikh's described the complexity, but I think we need to start by being very careful with our language and having an open heart and an open mind to this.
Tania.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with that comment. And I think that if we don't give people a voice in life that is meaningful and connects them to the community, and if they don't feel a sense of belonging, that they will act out and they'll actually find a voice in death because they don't value themselves and they don't value other people's lives as well. So we need to give people a voice. And the way that we do that in a social inclusion program called With One Voice is we bring together all the diverse people in our community, as Lisa has described. We bring together people like all of us here, doctors, lawyers, teachers, with people who are less fortunate, migrants, job seekers, people with depression and disabilities of all faiths and all backgrounds, aged 9 to 90. And together, we make up this incredible community. Not only do we sing together, but we have a wish list and we create supportive networks that help one another. And we all feel like we're part of the same family, and all the barriers between us start to disappear, and we realise actually we have a lot more in common than we have differences between us.
And can I say it works? I've sung in one of those choirs. My very bad voice was drowned out by everyone else's doing really well, which was great. Oh, thank you.
I think the other issue that we've got from the government's perspective, and I'm not just talking about the coalition government, I'm talking about the previous Labor government as well, is that Australians expect their governments to protect them. So when an event occurs, measures are taken to give not only comfort, but also at the same time put in place whatever systems are needed to ensure that all Australians live within a safe country. But the other part that we haven't really dwelt on is that whole inclusion element, the re-engagement and bringing people back into a community. I think the whole notion of community in many senses, Tony, has changed. In large cities, we talk about living in a suburb. We don't talk about living in a community anymore. In a country town, rural country towns, you live in a community. People pitch in and help each other. I don't see that in capital cities, and that's some of the dialogue we've got to have.
To be fair, Ken, there was some programs and some money with that. In your first budget, you took it out, and now that we've got a better Prime Minister, maybe you can put it back.
No, but there are budget constraints too, Adam, and you know that. And there's an obligation.
Okay, all right. Let's not go there just for a minute, because I want to bring Wesam back in to finish us up on this section. And look, I suppose this is all very well, and the inclusion programs and all of that sort of stuff may work quite well for the young kids in danger of being radicalised. What about the hardcore recruiters? What about the people who've already made up their minds, who are not prepared to change at all? Is there any way of reaching those people, changing them, or, as some have suggested, including the Prime Minister, do they just need to find another place to live?
Look, I mean, as for the language, love it or leave it, I mean, my job is to care for these youngsters. That's my job. I have to care for them. We can't shift the discussion, because if we just shift the discussion, then how do we ever break the cycle? I mean, it's very easy to just say love it or leave it. But how do we ever address this issue? We never end up addressing this issue, and that becomes very, very problematic. So we have to address the issue. I mean, love it or leave it. I understand. I really understand that people are frustrated, and it's, you know, that event that occurred, I mean, it's an event of great proportions. I mean, this is something that you know, saddens everybody. And so I understand why someone might feel the need to say love it or leave it. I get it.
Including within your own community, which is why I made the point. Malcolm Turnbull said it,
yes.
And so did the chairman of the mosque in Parramatta.
And I understand that, but ultimately at the end of the day, it is about really saving these kids from harming themselves and harming others, and we have to do that. Otherwise, you know, it's easy to say love it or leave it. It's easy to say love it or leave it, but it's difficult to actually
How do those kids
issues.
respond to that kind of language, just out of interest?
Well, I mean, being told that, I mean, again, you're already dealing with kids who have to justify their identity of where they're living. I mean, people who are already in this, and I'm talking very generally here, that people who already live in this country are already struggling with their identity. And so young kids already have to justify their identity of where they live. Australia is the only home they know. And so being told to get out, this is not your country, I'm speaking very generally. It's a very hard thing to take. Remember, the climate that they're being raised in is being formulated. So we have to be careful. We have to give it as much attention and love as we can to break this cycle. I understand the frustration, but can I just make one more point?
Yes, of course.
In terms of the de-radicalisation programs, I think it definitely is in the wrong department. It needs to be with the Department of Social. It has to be. I think it's a social factor, and it has to be in the DSS. It has to be in that department. And even terming a program de-radicalisation, you by default sideline a massive element of people, massive amount of people. So the name is wrong. It's in the wrong department, and ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to start doing things. We have to listen to our academics. We have to listen to our researchers. We have to listen to our community. We have to be genuine partners in this. It has to be a holistic effort if we're going to deal with the problem at the end of the day.
OK, we have to move on. Now, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. And keep an eye on our Twitter account for fact checks by The Conversation or the ABC fact-checking unit. Now, our next question is on a different subject, comes from Chris Hagan.
I think we'll look back on the offshore detention of refugees with the same level of horror and disdain as we do now with previous governments' abuse of human rights with stolen generations. And given that both the Coalition and Labor support the offshore detention of refugees, I'd like to hear from Adam Bandt How do you think that we can truly get Australians to change their thinking on this issue and actually come up with a policy that is empathetic, compassionate and upholds human rights?
Actually, I'm not going to start with Adam Bandt, although it's to him. We'll come to you in a moment. I want to hear from Lisa Singh first, because your immigration spokesman bought into this issue today, partly.
Well, I really think that the ongoing mandatory indefinite detention of people on Manus Island and Nauru has to stop. I think that the children need to be taken out of Nauru and our detention centres, and I think we do need to have a new conversation about refugee policy in this country. I think it will be a dark mark on our history. And whilst I know that both parties supported offshore processing, that's not what is going on. There is no processing going on. It is indefinite detention, and that is not humane. These are people that have, fled persecution. They are refugees. They've been deemed refugees, and yet they've been left languishing for years now, a couple of years now, on Manus Island, for example, with no end in sight about settlement. And there's been a lot of questions put to government as to why this has not occurred.
Both governments, obviously.
Well,
so
we were processing, Tony. We weren't leaving people languishing in Manus Island and Nauru for years and years on end.
That's because you weren't in government by the time they were in there for years, but you did set it up.
Well,
now,
yeah,
your immigration spokesman, Richard Marles, today came up with a bill to enforce mandatory reporting of child abuse in immigration centres. And I'm just going to ask you, frankly, was that some kind of huge oversight when you were in government, that mandatory reporting wasn't there?
No, what has occurred is in the last couple of years we've had, child abuse going on in Nauru to children. And so what Richard Marles, our immigration shadow minister today, has put in place is that if we are going to have children in detention, which we would prefer not, then we certainly don't want them abused. And if they are going to be abused, then we certainly want to know what's going on. And at the moment, we don't know that. So that's why that legislation is important. But the better outcome is to not have children in detention to start with. And that's what we need to be moving towards.
Adam Bandt.
Look, Labor set up these detention centres and said that we're going to put kids in them. And as a result, we now have these appalling situations where doctors are saying, I am not going to send a child back there because to send a child back there is to cause them harm. And as a doctor, my duty is to cause no harm. And they are saying that these places that are being funded by us as the Australian public and going on in our name, they're essentially mental illness factories. Now, no one wants to see people dying at sea. But I refuse to believe that our only choice is between people dying at sea and child abuse. I refuse to believe that. As Australians, I believe that we are a generous people and we can find a better way that allows people to come here through safer pathways so that they don't die at sea and so we don't lock them up and destroy lives. And I think in a generation or two's time, probably even sooner than that, kids are going to be saying to their parents, well, what did you do while children were being locked up and lives destroyed?
Ken Wyatt.
Tony, I want to come to that point because I want to remind Adam that he was part of the Rudd Labor government's strategy around the detention centres. When we came into government, there were 2,000.
That's not true.
There were 2,000 children within Nauru. We now have it down to about 104.
But
that's a significant shift. They are still being processed.
They weren't left languishing for years.
Yes, they were.
No, they weren't.
OK, Lisa, he listened to
Lisa.
you, and we're going to let him have his say now, OK?
And the process that Peter Dutton has in place means that people are being processed. The services have been there. Now, you made reference to child abuse. Child abuse, it appears, was going on during the time of the previous government. Nothing was done. Now, there are processes that the Minister for Immigration, Peter Dutton, is working through. We have relationships
in secret,
with...
Ken? I mean...
but he's working with state governments.
Can I just ask, why is it that the people who work with these children and women in these detention centres are forbidden to talk about it publicly?
It's part of a contract they have with the relevant companies, but the minister...
The contract is imposed on the company.
No, the contract...
It's part of legislation that you passed with Labor's support to say that if these people do what on the mainland
But Adam, if you
would
were
be an
serious-
obligation, on the mainland
if you
a
were
doctor or a
serious,
health
why didn't you
professional would be
tackle
required
this
to speak
when
up
you
if a
were
child was
in
being treated
partnership
like
with
this.
Labor?
Because we moved to end offshore
No, you didn't.
processing and Labor and the Coalition said, look, we have a lot more in common on this with each other than we do with the Greens. And so you decided to keep offshore processing. And now we are seeing that when you put people who are just coming here seeking a better life, when you put them in indefinite detentions in conditions that are worse than prison
But
because
Adam,
they've committed
you
no
were
crime,
complicit in
you
that.
break people.
For the 6 years, the Greens were complicit, so you
But I
cannot
asked the Prime
step
Minister...
aside.
Okay, I think we've actually
dealt
dealt with that issue, so just leave that aside for 1 second. And Ken, I'd just like to ask you, we have a new administration, you could argue a more moderate cabinet. Will we see a change in this position? Because there is now a strong movement to suggest, and those doctors and nurses, in fact all the hospital staff that came out over the weekend were clearly part of that, of people saying it's long enough to have kept these people permanently incarcerated because they've tried to come to this country, many of them as refugees. What is the government, your government, going to do about it? What do you think they should do?
Look, Minister Dutton is working through a number of issues. The processes that he's putting into place is moving towards the transferees having freedom on Nauru. We will continue, and we make no apology for this, we will continue to take a hard line that enables people smugglers to cash in on the misfortunes of other people. And if we open the floodgates like Labor did, then we were tackling the same problems. So there is a need to have in place strong measures that we will adhere to. Certainly children in detention is something that no government likes. And hence the reason we've moved from 400 now down to 100.
Okay. Is there any kind of timetable around this? And the question that people really want to know is, are these small group of people relatively going to be made a permanent example of? Because clearly being put into detention for trying to come here was to make an example so others would see it and not come. But can that example be a permanent state?
Well, it wasn't an example. It was Australia saying we will determine who comes here. People of poor character, we won't accept. People who are genuine refugees, we have accepted. We accept 13,000 plus refugees from UN and HRC refugee camps, and we process them. We've made the same comment in terms of Syria.
Sure, but I'm just making a
12,000.
very simple point, which is that at some point the government said no more. Anyone who comes will now be put in an offshore detention camp. That was done by the previous government. You've continued it. Will it be a permanent state for them?
I think in terms of anybody who comes by boat, they will go through a detention process so that we take them through a criteria selection in which we then determine who comes here as the government.
But why can't we let kids live in the community while the claims are being processed?
Because
Why do they have to be in mandatory detention?
They're with families, Adam.
But it's breaking them. It's killing them.
But it's also, if you take them away from families, you run the risk then of a stolen generation if we take the concept of what was raised.
So let them live with their carers once they've passed the security checks. Why do they have to live in indefinite detention that's breaking them and killing them?
I just want to hear from the other panellists here. And Tania, you've been listening to this. I'm interested in your view.
Yeah, look, I think that keeping kids in detention is child abuse. My mother was an enemy alien in Tatura in northern Victoria, and she still remembers the barbed wire fence. And so we have to keep kids out of detention, period.
Wesam, can I hear from you?
Well, they're not criminals. They're just seeking a better life. I mean, they left where they were to come to seek a better life at the end of the day. And I think we should accept them, because ultimately, at the end of the day, historically, Australia, after 1945, you know, they drafted up a refugee convention, and Doc Evatt was pivotal in that. And so historically, Australia has veered away from its position from where it was and where it is now. They're not criminals. It's almost like a sense of injustice. And, you know, if I could quote Aristotle, you know, Aristotle said that justice is the willingness to go against one's best interest, even against the interests of the group to which one belongs, because these are the demands of justice. And I think this is what has to happen here.
Okay, we're going to move on to a completely different subject. The next question is from Catherine Rowley.
Diabetes is the fastest growing chronic condition in Australia. 280 Australians develop diabetes every day. That equates to one person every 5 minutes. As a mother of a diabetic child who has battled this disease for 7 years now, every day I go to work hoping she's able to stay stable whilst at school. Then at night go to bed hoping I can keep her alive. That means every 2 hours I wake up and test her finger by a blood sugar testing machine and act accordingly. When will the government subsidise the proven and safe technology of a continuous glucose monitor for Australian diabetics to bring us into line with other countries and reduce unnecessary hospitalisation and the significant morbidity linked to diabetes?
Ken Wyatt.
There is work that is being done to address that issue. Minister Lay has been meeting with key stakeholders, meeting with parents, the Junior Diabetes Foundation, and both myself and Graham Perrott were chairs of the Diabetes, Parliamentary Friends of Diabetes, in which we lobbied very heavily, along with parents, for some changes to occur. Now, there is a national strategy that has been developed with a view to looking at tackling the issue of the rising number of Australians who are experiencing both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and then looking at providing the access to treatments. There are a number of people who have accessed new technology that is making life much better, and certainly the point that you make is something that I had not had an appreciation for until we had a group of mothers come and talk to us about waking up every 2 hours, and when their child received the pack and the sensor, then it made an incredible difference. They were able to sleep right through the night.
Can I just quickly go back to Catherine? How difficult and how expensive, I suppose, would it be for the government to do this? In your case, would it be a hugely expensive undertaking for governments? And how much would it change your life?
Well, as a single mum, it'd change it quite significantly. I can watch her from work and see what her sugar levels are doing. The current cost for a CGM is $5,000 per year, but it costs the government $14,000 per year to actually look after our children, look after all the diabetics through hospitalisation. So it would help prevent a lot of long-term complications. It would certainly give a lot of parents peace of mind. I know that I could actually get a full night's sleep. It'd just, decrease a lot of stress for a lot of us that don't sleep every night. We don't have jobs. I've only just gone back to work full-time myself because of financial implications. I can't afford to work part-time. I can't afford to stay at home and look after her. And a clear example of that was just last week. I pretty much got 3 hours sleep because for 8 hours I couldn't get her sugar levels above 4, which is dangerously low. We did go on a CGM for a trial last year, and in 1 week it actually saved her life 3 times. It alarmed to alert me that she was so critically low overnight that if I hadn't have acted, she would have passed away.
OK, I'm just going to ask Ken, you're the Assistant Minister, but obviously you have the ear of the Minister and indeed of the Prime Minister. Is this something that should be tackled immediately?
Yes, it is something that is important because of the number of mothers and fathers who are affected, but the number of children. And technology has advanced so much that it's an important way of giving comfort and assurance. Because it's not only at night time, it's also at school. And many of the mothers will say to us that the school will not administer the medication. The parents are required to go up there and be part of the treatment. And that is a strain on families. And the relationship between husbands and wives are also affected. So there is work that is being undertaken, and certainly there is a partnership with Diabetes Australia and with JDRF in making sure that these matters are being brought forward and for further consideration to be given within the budgetary processes.
Ken, as the first Indigenous person to hold this kind of office and for it to be in the health department's obviously very important. We're talking here about type 1 diabetes. There's an epidemic of type 2 diabetes in the Aboriginal community across Australia, and we're talking about very high rates of heart failure, of kidney disease, and even amputations as a consequence of that. Are you going to regard diabetes as a sort of cause that you will take on?
It's been a cause of mine since I've come into the Parliament, and it's certainly a cause that I will continue working on, because I wasn't focusing just on the Aboriginal community, and I know what the rates are amongst our people. They're horrendous. The amputations that occur annually, people who I have known over a period of time who've lost a foot, has impacted significantly. So my commitment is there, and it will be worked through the processes of working with the department, and certainly working closely with both of my colleagues, Fiona Nash, who is the Minister with Rural Health as her responsibility, but certainly Minister Lay, who is the Minister responsible for health across all Australians. And it is a growing issue, and it is a global issue. If I just give you one stat, if diabetes was a country, it would be the 5th largest country in the world. That's how many people across the globe are affected. And so there is much work we've got to do.
OK, we've got time for one last question tonight. It goes back to, well, hardcore politics, I suppose, and it's from Pelin Ursoy.
Yep. My question is for Mr Wyatt in particular. So on Saturday at the New South Wales Liberal Party State Council, Malcolm Turnbull's suggestion that the Liberal Party is not ruled by factions was met by laughter from the audience. So given this response, do you believe that Mr Turnbull was incorrect and that tensions within the party are an ongoing issue?
There's always factional groups within the Labor Party, and they're quite strong. Within the Liberal Party, what I read the Prime Minister to be saying is that in the leadership debate and the subsequent spill, that wasn't run by particular factions. It occurred. There was a process. And it was fairly rapid. And then we had the party room decision in which members voted. And of course, Prime Minister Turnbull won that leadership ballot.
Did he do you think he sort of misspoke at this New South Wales Council meeting? Because he said there's no factions in the Liberal Party, essentially, and all the people in the factions out in the audience laughed at him.
Yeah, I think he was talking about the parliamentary members. And certainly we have leanings across that continuum, like any party, where those who have left leanings and those who lean to the right, but often you work together for a common approach. And in that instance, I don't think that the time allowed for any factional aspect of the membership to ever come into play. It was about a leadership choice between Tony Abbott and Malcolm. And so on that basis, that's what he was reflecting. But certainly I know, and I saw the audience react to his comments.
And to go back to what the questioner asked, does that mean there are still tensions within the party, and particularly around Tony Abbott's supporters?
I think when you have a leadership change, there's always tensions, because there are people who gain, and certainly new portfolio appointments occur, but also change allows you to refresh a party. If we look at the history of all political parties in Australia, when there's a leadership change, there's often a change in the cabinet and assisting ministers. And that, in one sense, brings new talent in. It allows some of the others to have other experiences. But it's always, because somebody's exhilaration at being appointed to a cabinet role means it's somebody else's pain if they lose. And we've got to remember that. And it's a matter of healing people and bringing them back to the greater good of the nation and governing for Australians. OK, well, I'm going to quickly go around the panel. And Lisa, I'm not going to bring you up on the Liberal factions, because you've had your own problems with the Labor Party factions, indeed. Maybe you'd like to just reflect on the nature of factionalism in parties, and in your case in particular.
Well, Tania, I think
there'll be people who are watching you tonight wondering how the Labor Party could have done what they did to you.
Look, I think factions are a natural phenomenon that occur in political parties, and obviously are very alive and well in the New South Wales Liberal Party, as we saw on the weekend. And they are in the Labor Party as well. But I think that when there is a certain, few at the top, perhaps within that faction, that kind of dictate to members how things should be, how people should vote, rather than, entrusting members to vote how they see fit according to their own values or conscience. That's when I think there's a problem, and I think that's a debate that's worth having. It's
a debate you should have in Tasmania, is it? Because you end up being replaced by a middle-aged white male from the AMWU, and I'm wondering what that tells you and us about the modern Labor Party.
Well, as I said, it's a debate worth having.
You want to go any further than that at this point in your career?
Well, obviously, Tony, it's very disappointing. But the disappointment's not just shared by me, it's shared by some of my caucus members, by Labor Party members, by the community. Pre-selections are never an easy thing. I think we'll all attest to that. But, for me, I'm 43 years old. I've still got just about 2 years left of my Senate term. There's still a lot I want to do. I've still got a lot of passion for ideas and a lot to contribute, so we'll see what goes on after that.
Adam Bandt, now, if there were no such thing as factions in the Greens, you'd probably be the leader.
Well, we have differences of opinion, we have groupings, but I don't think we have factions in the way that we
don't call them factions, you call them groupings.
Well, no, they're not factions. They're not factions in the way that someone from on high comes down and says, this is how you're going to vote. And factions are the reason that we're not having a vote on marriage equality at the moment. I mean, there are factions in the Liberal Party. The hard right helped put Malcolm Turnbull in, and they've got him by the short and curlies at the moment, and he's been required to say, I'm going to not have a vote on marriage equality. Factions in the Labor Party means that even though all three leaders of our political parties at the moment support marriage equality, we're not allowed to have a vote on it because the people in the Labor Party are entitled to go and vote and cross the floor as well. So I don't think they're a good influence on the political system.
OK, we've heard from the three politicians. We are out of time, I'm afraid. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Tania, Jong, Ken Wyatt, Wesam Charkawi, Adam Bandt and Lisa Singh. Thank you very much. Now, next Monday, a special Boyer Q&A on foreign affairs with the former Foreign Minister Bob Carr, Boyer lecturer Michael Fullilove, who argues Australia needs an ambitious foreign policy to meet the global challenge as power shifts east, diplomat turned academic Alison Bronowski, the Australian Director of Human Rights Watch Elaine Pearson, and the Deputy Director of Melbourne Uni's Centre for Chinese Studies Sao Keat Tok, which way to a larger Australia? That is indeed the name of the Boyer Lectures. Title, I should say. Join the Q&A Boyer special next week. Until then, good night.